Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just do a demo of a very simple case, making a guide and using the wizard workflow. Okay, so I've made videos like this before, but it's been quite a while, so I just want to show it. And really, I'm trying to prove the point that this is not a difficult process. Anyone can start doing this. You do need to have all the same implant education and surgical skill and everything like that, but case in, case out, having a surgical guide is going to make your results more consistent, and I think it's going to make you provide a better service for your patient. So here we've launched Blue Sky Plan. Now the software is entirely free. Anyone can go and download this right now. There's no cost associated with downloading it, and using it, practicing with it. The way this works is that basically once you have designed a surgical guide or a denture or aligners or whatever the case may be, in Blue Sky Plan, you're going to need to export that to either have it 3D printed or mill it. And so when you go to export it, it's going to just charge you an export from Blue Sky Plan. Again, that can range from 10 to 20, 23, $24, depending on how many you buy at once. But it's a minimal cost on this, and I could design 4 different guides and export them all. I'm still only going to get charged one export. It'll just simply deduct that from the software, and then you can go print it and do whatever you need to do. Now, real quick, before we jump right into the case and start planning, I wanted to do just a time lapse of working through this case without talking and everything. Because here's the reality, I know I'm long-winded, and I'm going to hit all these steps in painstaking detail. And I don't want, if this video ends up being 20 or 30 minutes, for you to think that that's how long it takes to do one of these. It doesn't. This is a very fast, simple process. So this will be kind of the 50,000 foot overview, and then we'll follow this up and we'll do it in detail, working through it and explaining steps. All right, so here you see we're opening the case. We've limited our field of view. It's detecting the nerves, and now we're bringing in the STL model. Okay, we verify that it's stitched well, and then we're going to place a tooth for prosthetic positioning, and then we're going to adjust our implant position based on that. And that's really it. Now we design the surgical guide, just draw the perimeter. There it is. Now that gets exported. Software generates a drill report, which you save, and then it'll add your parts to your cart, and that's it. And as you can see here, without me talking and narrating every step in detail, it took me 4 minutes and 1 second. Now, your first case, it will take you a little longer than that, but it shouldn't take you that long. I think 10 minutes is very reasonable because, again, it's stepping you through every single step of the process. So now that you've kind of seen in a real world example about how long this takes, now let's go in and go ahead and do this case in detail. So all I've done is launch Blue Sky Plan, and now we're going to go ahead and start the process here. So I'm going to click on Implant Planning and Surgical Guides. Now, first thing to know here is you've got a few options. If all you had was scanned models and you were going to do a surgical guide, obviously you wouldn't have the information provided by a CT scan, but perhaps it's better than nothing. If you've got plenty of bone, maybe even if you've done bone sounding and you know the contours of the bone and what's underneath the model, sometimes you might opt to not do a CT. I wouldn't personally, but a lot of people do that. In such case, I could just say import models, and we could just plan this as a model-based surgery, right, and make a surgical guide. If you click on Import Patient CT Scan, it's just going to open the software in what's called advanced mode, which is basically where everything's kind of manual. You'll have to kind of know what steps to go through. Now, the advantage to advanced mode is you've got a lot more versatility. You can do things that aren't typical. You've got more flexibility. Full disclosure, I work almost exclusively in advanced mode, but that's because that's kind of how I learned it, and because I'm usually doing more difficult cases on this. But then finally, we've got this heading that says 1 or 2 implant cases. Now this is going to launch what we call the wizard workflow. And the wizard is great for beginners because it's going to literally step you through every single step. It'll have little hints up there for at any point if you don't know what to do, there's a thing you can click on and it'll tell you exactly what needs to be done in that step. So I want to demonstrate this for straightforward, easy cases for people just getting into surgical guides. I think this is a very simple way to go. You don't need a course for this or anything like that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click on 1 or 2 implant cases. And here you're going to tell it what type of STL are we bringing in. Is it just a traditional STL, such as would come out of an intraoral scanner or a desktop scanner? Is it a CT scan of a stone model? Blue Sky will turn that into an STL. If you remember, we need two pieces of data to do a guided surgery. We need an STL model of the arch, and we need a CT scan of the arch. All right, really the cone beam is the only thing you've got to have, because if you've got that, you could CT scan a stone model. You could also CT scan a PVS impression. And then this impression with markers, that's for a scan appliance. We won't really talk about that right now, but we're just going to import a model STL. This was a desktop scan of a stone model that I've got in this case. And then go ahead and tell it what kit you're using. You know, there's a lot of different systems in here. Now, personally, I think Blue Sky is an excellent system, and it's affordable, and that is what I personally used. But you know, there's a lot of different implant systems out there, and depending on the system you're using is going to determine, you know, what virtual implants are available to you to insert into the case, and then it's also going to dictate the size of the guide tube, the offsets. All of that is matched to whatever you choose right here. So I'm going to keep it simple and use the Blue Sky Bio fully guided surgical kit. That would be the keyless system. And so once I click that, it's going to ask me to import the DICOM data. Now you always import the DICOM data of the patient first. So imagine if you had a CT scan of a patient, and then you also took a CT scan of their model. Well, you always do the patient scan first. So again, this is just a very simple lower number 19, I believe it is. Very easy case. And so it's importing the data right now. And once it does, it's going to give us the opportunity to limit the field of view. Now you can see here, this is a very large field of view scan. Just to orient you here, here's the maxilla, here's the mandible, this is the orbit, this is the airway, this is the spine. You know, there's nothing going on in this patient's spine that's going to affect my treatment plan for a lower first molar implant. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and limit my field of view down. Part of the value in doing this is that it's going to cut down drastically on the amount of data that the software has got to manage and that your computing system has to manage. You know, it can be significantly slower depending on your computer specs if you've opened this huge volume. So really, we're worried about this lower, you know, number 19 area. So I need the mandible. I generally will keep both jaws, you know, up at least to the apices of the roots, but I especially want the full jaw of where I'm going to be placing the implant. Okay. So I've limited this. If you need to, you can, you know, if the patient was angled during their scan, you can twist these rings and fix that. But we'll click OK. And as you see right here, the software is automatically going to begin detecting the nerves and mapping the nerve in the software. Very important step for a mandibular case especially, you know, for anything behind the mental foramen, because obviously it's going to be a bad day if we hit that nerve. So you can see here the nerve has been mapped. Now I've got the option to scroll through here and evaluate that nerve mapping. So I don't really care about this side because I'm not doing anything over there, but here I do want to go through and, you know, there's a lot of automated functions in Blue Sky. They work exceptionally well and I trust them, but I always verify. There's occasionally circumstances like lots of metal restoration, scatter, bone plates, things that can throw this off a little bit, so trust it but verify. And so as I'm scrolling through here, and I can even maximize this window, I'm just looking to see that that nerve that it has mapped is tracking along where that inferior alveolar canal is. All right, now one good example of where this may not work ideally is I'm sure everyone has seen a jaw where, you know, they call it hollow mandible syndrome, where there's this big dense cortex and then the interior of the bone just looks like there's nothing there. Well, now it's kind of all soft tissue inside of the bone, and the software can't clearly distinguish where the inferior alveolar canal is versus anything else. So this one looks great. You can see it's tracking exactly along here. If I did need to alter this a little, you see anywhere there's one of these little ringed nodes, I could grab that and move it, but there's no need for me to do that here because it's done it perfectly. Okay, and you could also look in your pano window and you could scroll in and out and see that everything is tracking along there properly. This one's done a great job. We're just going to go ahead and click next. All right, so now it knows every case has to have cone beam data, which we've imported, and then it needs STL data. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to where I have that STL for this patient stored. It's this case 1 gingiva. This is one of the first cases we do in my courses. I'm going to click open. Now this is probably the most important step in any guided surgery case, is making sure that you absolutely nail the stitch between the STL model and the CT scan. Okay, now I used to have to spend, it seemed like, a third of a course teaching people to do this and evaluate it and all that kind of thing, but that's unnecessary now. Now all we've got to do is tell Blue Sky, is this a mandible or maxilla? Well, this is a mandible, so we'll click OK, and within a few seconds it's going to have this thing stitched. Now again, always verify it, and I'll show you how I would do that. But this automatic alignment is a huge time saver. It really makes this process a lot easier. Alright, so you see now that yellow model, the STL has been imported, and there's two primary views where I'm going to evaluate the accuracy of that stitch. One is in this axial view. Okay, so as I zoom in here, I'm making this full screen. You can always just click these corner nodes and make a window full screen. And now I can go up and down. So what you're looking for is you want to see this tight adaptation between the CT data, like here you see the teeth, and you're primarily going to be evaluating the teeth, because obviously CT scans don't show soft tissue. Okay, and what you want to see is that as you scroll up and down through this volume, you see how these cusp tips are disappearing at the same rate on the CT scan as they are on the STL model. That's indicative of a really good stitch. Okay, so that looks excellent. I'll usually also evaluate it in this view. This is the cross-sectional view. And again, I'm going to scroll throughout the arch, and I'm just verifying that this model adaptation is very tight to the CT scan data. And again, this looks great. And we can go through and see that that's the case all the way back to the molar areas. Okay, so it's not good enough just to be stitched well in one area. You really need this thing to be stitched properly across the entire arch. Okay, so we're going to click next. Before I do that, let me point out part of the beauty of the wizard mode and why it's great for beginners is because it's going to show you where you are in the process, how much more you've got to go. But for example, if you didn't remember, how do I know if this was a good stitch, or how do I bring in the data and whatnot? All you got to do is click on this video up here, and it's going to show you exactly what needs to be done. Eliminates any questions about things. Okay, so I'll click next. I don't need to hit that video because obviously I've done this 1,000 times. So implantology is always got to be prosthetically driven. Okay, now granted, this is a lower molar, you probably know where a molar goes on that, but still, I like to always do this because even, slight angulation changes can make the difference in potentially having to use a custom abutment versus screw retained, you know, plus it's just easy. I mean, let's go ahead and do the wax up. So you've got multiple libraries of teeth that you could choose from. I'm gonna just go with, let's use Christian Brennis's tooth library here. This is a tooth number 19, so I will click that. Now you've also got down here, perhaps if you had already looked at this CT scan and you have a good idea of what implant size you wanted to place, you could go ahead and select that here. You can always change that though later. So let's hypothetically say that we're going to place a 5x11. Again, I've done this case a million times, so I tend to know what size it needs, but I'll show you how you would change that if you didn't. Alright, so we'll click, and you see I've got a crosshair with a tooth under it. And wherever I click next is where it's going to drop that tooth and the implant. So I'm going to just go right in the middle of my edentulous site, click, and used to you would just drop it in and you would have to then manually position it and all that kind of stuff. This is a newer feature where it's going to get a pretty close positioning of that tooth. And now it's not always perfect, and I can see there's some minor tweaks that I would make. For example, stretching this tooth a little bit so that it's fully filling that space from mesial to distal. And so anytime I hover on that tooth, you see a widget appears. Alright, so if I wanted to rotate it, I can do that here. If you ever do something and want to undo it, like I do right now, hit Control Z and it will correct that. If I wanted to rotate it in this axis, I could just spin it a little bit that way. All right. If you needed to stretch the tooth, then you would simply hover on it, make the widget appear, and you can grab these nodes that are on the side of the tooth. Okay, so if I wanted to stretch it in a horizontal direction, I just pull on that one a little bit. If I wanted to bring it to the buccal, I'll just pull it this way a little bit. And then similar for mesial distal, right? If I hover, I can grab this node, pull it back to fill that space, and sometimes you might have to tilt it up a little bit to see your widget, but again, this is not going to be the final crown or anything, so it's not absolutely critical that this thing be perfect, but I do like to have it pretty close. All right, that is a pretty good idea of where this tooth belongs. I could even stretch it a little bit vertically, but let's go with that. We'll go ahead and click next, but in this step, all we're doing is focusing on the tooth. All right, now in this step, you've got the opportunity to tweak the implant. So the implant is going to just be oriented directly under that tooth, and it's always going to require a little bit of tweaking. Okay, so I'm going to just take this implant, I'm going to pull it over here into the bone, and this is where you've got to know all the principles of implant placement. So making the guide is the easy part. The treatment planning of knowing where an implant should go for ideal prosthetic and surgical positioning, that's a different animal. You could make a guide and follow the process perfectly, but if you don't have the implant where it really ought to be within the bone, you're just going to have a guide that ensures you're putting it into the wrong position. So we don't want to do that. We want to get this thing ideal. And the reason for the two screens right here is one, this is called a tangential view. So basically, when I scroll my mouse, this is just spinning that implant on its axis, okay? So I'm looking here in the cross-sectional view, basically, and this looks pretty good. If I wanted to adjust my buccal lingual trajectory of this, I could do so right here. And so I'm looking right here, and I'd like to see this thing come directly through the central groove. Now, two ways I can get there. I could bodily move this thing a little more lingually, but I'd rather not do that in this case. I'd rather keep it kind of in the center of this ridge. So what I can do is just take this, hover on it, you'll get the same widget, and I just want to make this thing come out right there in the central groove, okay? Now when I spin it around and look at it from the buccal dimension, I can tell that I would like this to be right in that central fossa, so I want to lean this, this platform a little bit mesially. So always try to be kind of in the center of your edentulous space, and you pretty much want to follow close to the trajectory of those adjacent roots. Okay, so right there looks like a great position. If we wanted to do a screw retained crown here, this would be the perfect position for that implant. Again, a huge ridge. I know this could be done freehand by most people. This would be a perfect case to practice freehanding. But again, what are we trying to prove? Why don't we just have a guide that makes it so easy and leave nothing up to chance, right? So I like to place this particular implant, which has a conical connection. I would like to place that about 1 millimeter subcrestal. And now if I wanted to zoom in at any point, I can hold my right mouse and just zoom by pushing forward and back, okay? Same over here. If I'm trying to spin this model, that is left click and hold, right? If I wanted to bodily move this, I would just hold down either right and left mouse or hold down your scroll ball, and you can see I can bodily move that. Same applies over here, all right? So that's usually one of the trickiest things for newcomers to figure out. It's just how to manipulate the mouse to make the models and the images do what you want. But you can see here, the crest of bone is right there, so I'm about 1 millimeter subcrestal. I'm just eyeballing that. This looks like an ideal position for that implant. We'll click next. And remember that at the first step, we told it what implant system we were using, what guided kit. And so based on that fact and what implant we placed, the software already knows the size of the guide tube, its offset, its hole diameter, all of that stuff we already know. So at this stage, all we're going to do is go ahead and draw the guide curve or the outline of where you want your guide to be. Now you can see here as I'm clicking, nothing's happening. And if you forget this, again, just watch the little video. But the way that you'll start drawing your guide curve is hold down your shift button. So you see when I hold down shift, I get a crosshair instead of my mouse arrow. So I'm going to just start clicking my way around the perimeter of where I want this guide to seat. And I'm generally going to go right at the CEJ of the teeth. And as far as how far around the arch I go, I usually want to get at least a half arch, maybe a tooth or two beyond that. And then as I get to that point where I want to come over to the lingual, I'll reorient this a little bit just by letting go of shift, and then hold shift again, click my way around. Now let go of shift. I'm going to look at it from the lingual, and again, hold shift and begin clicking your lingual contour of the guide. And we're just going to click our way around until we get back to where we started. All right. Now, one thing that you need to be aware of, you see that this node is red and that one is green. We want to go ahead and join those, and you can either do that. Let me, well, I can't undo that. If you just click real close to this one, it will join this into a continuous curve. Or you could just take the green node and drag that node into the red one to close this contour. But that's going to be my guide perimeter. If I want to, I can right click on this and add a window. So why do we add windows? Well, how do you verify if a guide is fully seated? You know, I mean, obviously you want to look for gaps in between the guide and the teeth that it's resting on. So I like to add some windows in various places around the arch just so that I can visually see when I print this guide and I seat it, I can visually see that that guide is fully seated. All right, you don't have to do this. This is an optional step, but I think it's wise to do so. It only helps you, in my opinion. All right, so let's put one right there and then maybe one more right here. Again, similar to the stitch we talked about earlier, it's not good enough to be fully seated in just one area of the arch. You really got to be seated all the way around the arch, or that guide is not going to put the implant where you've positioned it in the software. All right, so the widget works just the same way as the tooth widget does. All right, you know, here you can see I'm gonna just basically open a window on the buckle. And just for what it's worth, oftentimes, you know, your guide tube, it's going to clear out a perimeter, usually about a 15 millimeter diameter around the center of this guide tube, and that's for the access of your handpiece head. So by default, what oftentimes happens as it trims out that space for your handpiece is that you'll get a little window right here and a little window right here. So knowing that I'm going to have one here, 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 and here, still got plenty of space for the guide to rest on hard tissue. I think I'm ready to go with this, and so we'll click next, and the software is going to design the guide. And there we have it. So as you see, it's cleared out a 15 millimeter diameter circle around this. That's the access for your handpiece to get in, and usually that means it's going to end up cutting some windows on those teeth adjacent to it. I've got a window here, got a window here. So when I go and, you know, I'm doing the surgery, I want to seat this in the mouth, and I want to make sure that this looks exactly the same way in the mouth that it does here in the software, that there's no big gaps. If there's a gap, that probably means that, you know, something was wrong with your STL model. So imagine you scanned a stone model and it had a big bubble in it, and you know the guide gets built down into that bubble. Well, now you've got a prematurity that you're going to have to adjust in the guide, or you need to fix that STL ahead of time. But don't proceed with the surgery until you know that this guide is fully seating right here and it's nice and stable and in place. Okay. So this looks great. We've got the proper tube hole for the fully guided surgical kit from Blue Sky Bio. We're ready to go ahead and proceed. So we'll click next. Now the software is asking me where do I want to save this guide. And so let's just choose our desktop. I'll click OK. It is going to save the project, so save this whole plan so that maybe during surgery you can reopen it and have that up to view during the procedure. You know, if you had a question about how far the nerve is or whatever, you can just scroll through there and look at it. And then plus you always need to save these cases. They're part of the patient's medical record. So legal reasons, all kinds of stuff, you've got to save these projects. So I'd suggest you just have a place on your main computer or wherever your patient data is stored that you dump all your intraoral scans and CT scans and your blue sky plans and all that. And I just create a folder with that patient's name and just store it all in there where it's together. That way, if you ever need to reference it in the future, you can. Now, it's asking, do I want to complete a case approval form before sending? No, that has more to do with, if you're doing this with a lab or something and they're planning it and you need to view it. We're not going to worry about that. So I'm going to click no. And now it's asking us where we would like to save the drill report. Again, I dump it into that same folder. We could call it, you can change the name, call it, John Doe drill report, or whatever you want to do. But what the drill report is this is a PDF form that it's going to create that has all the pertinent information, right? The site number, which implant you're using, its length and diameter, the kit, the metal cylinder that you need to use, all of that pertinent information. And then it's also going to generate a few images. So usually a 3D view, a pano view, where you can kind of look at it at a quick glance. And then it's going to give you usually a buccal view of your implant and then a cross-sectional view of your implant. And what's nice about this is that I could print this thing out and just tape it up on the unit behind the patient. So rather than degloving and scrolling through the case, I can just at a glance look at this and say, okay, I have plenty of room to the nerve, and if I wanted to go up in length, I can do that, or width, or whatever. You've just got all of those pertinent images right there at a glance. All right, so we can minimize that. We've saved it, and this is just asking if we want to open the folder, and I'm going to just say okay. And now we can click next. And what you see here is that if you've used the Blue Sky implants, you can see everything has been added to your cart on the Blue Sky website, right? And for example, if I already have the keyless kit, I could just X that out. If I already have the tube, I could X that out. Because a lot of people do get confused over, well, what guide tube do I need to purchase and everything? Well, that's all done for you in the software. You'll see it on your drill report. Even if you're not using a Blue Sky implant, it's still going to call for a particular tube. And let's say if you were using BioHorizons or Nobel or whatever, then it's going to automatically select the appropriate guide tube for that system, and it'll add it to your cart in Blue Sky. Here we've got the implant as well, and you can just simply check out. Now let's say you already have all of these things, well then you can just disregard this and not worry about it. But that is basically the entire case, okay? So at the last step here, it can ask me, do I want to start a new case or just close the wizard? When I close the wizard, it's going to basically put you in the standard advanced viewing mode, right? And this is more of that standard advanced mode where you've got the 5 windows to evaluate, but everything's been done for you here, okay? So I could have just started in this view in advanced mode and done each of those steps in a similar process and gotten to the same endpoint. But again, the beauty of the wizard is that for easy routine cases, onesie twosies, and especially for beginners that may not know their way around the software really well just yet, it just steps you through every single step. And so it's kind of hard to screw up, honestly. There's a few very important key things that you need to make sure of, that the nerve is mapped properly, that the stitch was done properly. Again, generally it's done perfectly by the software automatically, but you just always verify that. But here is our final surgical guide, right? And so now we've got a surgical guide made. All we need to do is 3D print that. And so at this point, I'm basically done in the software. I'm going to go ahead and open up my 3D printing software. So, lots of printers will work for this process. I'm going to be using a SprintRay Pro 95. And so I'm just launching my SprintRay software. And I really just want to show this process from A to Z just to prove how easy this is. Okay, so here's the SprintRay software. You can see we've got surgical guide 3 resin chosen, but you can change whatever resin you want to do. We'll go ahead and stick with that. Do I want to print at 50 or 100 microns? I pretty much exclusively use 100 microns on surgical guides. There's really no value in going up beyond that. And now I just need to add in the model that I'm going to be 3D printing. Okay, so click on the Add Model button. And remember how we saved all this to the desktop? So it saved your case to the desktop, it saved your STL model of the guide to your desktop. Wherever you chose to save that, everything is there now. And so here you see surgical guide. I'll click open, and there's the surgical guide that I need to print. All right. Now I like to print this with the intaglio facing up because I don't want to build supports into that surgical guide that potentially could affect the fit. That would be another big potential reason why a guide wasn't fully seating. If you had this oriented 180 degrees over with the intaglio facing down, you're going to have to build supports in it, and if those don't get trimmed properly, again, you've got a prematurity. So as far as adding supports, the software is telling me here I've got a high chance of print failure because there's undercuts and things on this model. All I've got to do is say fix it, and it's going to build in those supports. And now this is ready to print. Now, just for the heck of it, I'm going to also print the model because I want to print both of these and just show the fit of it. And we can go ahead and bring in another model. And here you see that case 1 gingiva. That was the one that we brought into the case. Now, one nice little feature about the SprintRay printer is that you can see here, this is how most STLs are going to come to you out of a scanner. They're going to be a one-dimensional skin, I'll call it, right? Where this looks like a 3D model, but there's really not any three-dimensionality to it. There's not a bottom on it. And generally, you would have to go and base that model. You can absolutely do that in Blue Sky Plan in the model editing module. There's a close model feature, and we could go there and do it. In fact, let me just show that real quickly. All right, we've still got our case open here. I'm going to just hide the guide. I don't need the implants or nerves or anything on right now, but here's that model, and we could just go into the model manipulation panel. And so if you don't see that panel, go to panels, model manipulation. This will pop up. But what you'll see here is that you've got a choice to put in the drop down menu which STL are you wanting to close. I want to close this gingival model. It's a mandible. All I got to do here is put close model. And now you see that that has been given a base, and now we've got a solid model that this is a three-dimensional watertight model that can actually be printed. That's what we're after if you actually wanted to print the model, which is not a necessity, but I like to do it generally. I can hide the original STL. Again, let's just show the difference here. That's the one that doesn't have a watertight model, so you can't really print this shape, whereas this one, it's completely solid. We can print this one. Now, while we can print this one, the one downside to doing it this way is that I can tell this is going to use a fair amount of resin. It's going to take a lot of resin to print this big solid model. So the option I would go with more often, let's go back and just turn that one off. The other option you've got in that model manipulation panel is you could just tell it, I want to turn that case 1 gingiva into a hollowed model. And that's going to probably cut down on the resin used to print this by, 80%. All right, so you'll see this is going to generate a new model. Again, let's turn off the original intraoral scan, and it's still the same model, but now it has been based and hollowed, and it's got, this cross-hatching pattern for stability. So if I did all this in Blue Sky Plan and I wanted to export this to print, I just go to File, Export Data, and tell it that I want to export just this model. So anything you want to export here, your implant, all that kind of stuff you can do. I just want to export this model. And you can see it's telling me I've got 46 exports remaining. But remember, you've already exported once from this case. You're not going to get another one deducted here just for doing the model. All right, so when I click that, I'm going to, again, save this. We'll call this hollowed model. It did not deduct another export, and I can show you that by going to export data. You can see I've still got 46 remaining. All right, so just know that people will sometimes be a little stingy about exporting models and whatnot, and so just know it's not going to deduct one from you. All right, so let's bring that in. All right, and if you want to, you can just base this right to here. And again, the nice thing with the software, it's going to tell you if there's a problem with this. So can I print this without supports? Well, no, when I hover on it, it's telling me I've got a thumbs down, I need better support. So I'll fix it. Now, going back to what I was going to say earlier about kind of a nice feature in the Sprint Ray printer is that, let's say if you didn't want to do that in Blue Sky and you just wanted to make this a solid model, Sprint Ray's got the option where it says, hey, you've got an unrepaired intraoral scan, you've got to repair it. So I can do that here as well, just by hitting Fix. And as you can see, it has based the model. Now, while this works, I generally don't use this because, again, I'm back to having just a big solid model that I would rather have this be hollowed. And you also don't have, a lot of control over the trajectory that base gets built in. So I'm just going to delete this one. So these are the two models I want to print, and I just like to put them in the center of the print bed here. All right. Now you could also, just for what it's worth, you could print it like this, right? And you could fit more things on the build plate, but printing, the length of time it takes to print is determined by how tall the objects are. Because remember, it's building this 100 micron layer by 100 micron layer by 100 micron layer. So the more 100 micron layers you have to go, the longer this print's going to take. So I don't want to do that. I want to lay it down as flat as possible. All right, and once again, I'll add the supports to it. And there we have it. All I got to do now is go to my printer and tell it I want to print this. Everything's chosen correctly, and you can see this is going to be 46 minutes. So I'm printing it. Right now it's sending this wirelessly to the printer, and that printer has already got the surgical guide resin in it. It's going to start the print, and then in 46 minutes I'll have this case and I'll show taking it off and getting it ready to use. Okay, so it's been 46 minutes, our 3D print is done, and I just put on some gloves, and I've got my little squeegee thing that most printers are going to have. So we open this up, we're going to unlock the build plate, and you can see there is our 3D printed guides and our model. Now there's always going to be some excess resin, and so take your little squeegee and squeegee that off, just so that you're not wasting resin. Probably not making that big a difference in how much is saved, but it does make some, and it's going to cut down on, how much you're dirtying up your alcohol. And so I'll give you a little shot of this. So now let's go ahead and remove these from the build plate and wash them. So again, here's the view of the build plate before we detach these. And so what we got to do now is remove them from the build plate. And this is very simple. You'll just take the little scraper that comes with your printer, and you're looking to get up under an edge. And as you do, you'll see this thing just pops right off. All right, so now those are both off, and we can set the build plate down. So once they're off the build plate, now we need to wash it, because there is going to still be some residual resin of whatever you printed in that's on this. I mean, it's sticky and you can feel it on there. And so that's got to be removed before we can cure this. And so I have just a very basic wash station set up right here. Now there's a lot of automated systems. I have several of them. They do work well. But frankly, for me personally, I find it just simplest just to have 2 containers of alcohol. This being my dirty alcohol bath, and this one more of a clean alcohol bath. And so usually what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put it in the dirty alcohol bath, give it a little rinse, and then I always have some kind of a little brush that I can agitate this. It doesn't take a lot. Okay, we're going to agitate this for just a second. Particularly around the teeth. We don't want any residual wet resin hanging around on that, because then it's going to affect the shape of the model, and that'll affect the fit of your guide. And so just washing that real good, give it a rinse, and then that's gotten the bulk of the resin off. Let it drain a second. That's when I'll go into my clean alcohol bath, and this one's just going to get a quick shake off to get it really nice and clean. And I just find that this system has been the easiest for me, and it's quick. A lot of the automated washes are going to take several minutes. This I can do in 40 seconds if I want to. And now with that done, I've usually got some paper towels. I'll just set that face down to drain for a moment. Now the supports, we could remove them now at this stage, or we can remove them after we've cured it. If your supports were built up into the intaglio, I would say go ahead and remove the supports before curing, because otherwise it's going to be really difficult to get in here with a brush. Very, very important that you agitate the intaglio of your guide, or really any kind of precision fit appliance, to get any of that resin that's pooled up in the cusp tips out of there. Otherwise it's, again, not going to fit. The exterior here, I don't really care that much about it. If there's a bit of excess resin that's remaining on that, it's really not going to affect anything. So there is the initial rinse, and now we'll just give it the final rinse in the clean alcohol bath, and then drain that. So I'm just going to let the alcohol drain off of that. If you wanted to blow off that alcohol to get it dry, but do try to get it dry before you stick it into your curing unit. And after that, we just cure it and we're ready to go to surgery. So I've taken some compressed air and I just went ahead and dried this off, but here's what I wanted to show you is that even now, before I've removed supports, since none of those are on the intaglio surface, you can see my guide is fitting perfectly. Very stable, no movement whatsoever. So now I'm going to stick these into my curing oven. And there's lots of different curing ovens that are out there. Could you just set this out in some UV light in the sun? Sure, but one thing I will say is that these resins are approved by the FDA, assuming that they're being cured at a certain temperature for a certain time and at a certain wavelength. If you're just sticking it out in the sun, that's not going to be very controlled. And so if we want to get this thing to its full strength and make it as good as we can, we ought to use a legitimate curing unit. I have probably 5 or 6 different units. They all work, same principles. This one I like. This is the Cure N. This is just kind of a faster curing unit. Does a really nice job. But we'll just wait for this to cure. It'll take about 3 or 4 minutes, and then it's going to be ready to use. Okay, so we've cured our guide and the model, and I just used a cutoff wheel to remove the supports. And now we can check how everything looks and fits. And hopefully you can see there, we've got a very precise fit onto the teeth of the model. And again, absolutely critical that when you go into surgery that the guide be seated fully on the model, just like you're seeing right here. And so I don't have a guide tube handy, but all we would really do at this point is just stick the guide tube in there. I'll usually put a drop of super glue or something just to hold it in, and then proceed with surgery. Going back to your drill report, you'll have the full sequence of drills that need to be gone through, and then you would place your implant fully guided on the guided driver, and that would be it. So again, there's still a lot of ways that you can screw this up. You've still got to respect all the principles of surgical technique and asepsis and not overheat the bone and everything. But as far as getting the implant in the correct position where it needs to go, hopefully you see that this is a very simple process that really anyone can do. And so anyway, I hope you found that helpful.